Hi, students. So we had low attendance, and I think that's because it's a time of the year when everything is very germ filled. And so if you're sick, I'm sorry to hear that. I just want to be sure that I get sort of a unanimous exposure to the Monday lecture because the lecture that we had on Blood Meridian on Monday is foundational to kind of the rest of the course. Um, so if you don't grab onto it, then I'm afraid that the rest of the term won't really make sense to you. Um, just to recap, kind of important themes of the semester. We have graduated now to the point where we're able to look at fiction for the sake of philosophy, right? We're moving from reading sort of more explicitly philosophical texts to fiction as a way for us to reflect on and ask important questions. And there are some things that fiction can do for philosophy that other writing forms can't. And this is part of why, we've talked about this before. This is part of why Plato writes in dialogue. And I've also talked to you about narrative and the connection between narrative structures and ethics and inquiry. And we talked a little bit about Alistair MacIntyre when we did that. So we've graduated to now we are going to be the ones reading a work of fiction for the sake of philosophy. The other thing to recap is that it's important to mention that the themes of the course are consistent throughout, and they kind of culminate in our reading of this book. The way that we've kind of looked at things is to recognize that the world is fraught with goodness and evil. It's hard to say that the world is one or the other. It's like there's appearances of goodness, appearances of evil. In our experience. And the types of good we encounter tend to be imperfect, even if you might say they're still very good. And the types of evil we encounter, there's times that evil, it's not that it's good, but that something comes out of it that could be good. So in this environment, another thing that you see is things like contingency, unpredictability, fate, fortune, sort of maybe the seeming untamable power of nature, the kind of things that humans really, in the face of the power of things like chance or things like nature, we feel our limitations quite clearly. So this is the world that we experience and inhabit. And one of the things we've talked about is that the human has a sort of responsive freedom, meaning we don't have freedom to create from nothing. We don't have a sort of limitless freedom. We are able to exercise freedom in contexts, and a lot of times we're making choices between things that we did not bring about, or we might not have even created, but we're still able to make choices. And so human freedom is this really important quality, because if you have this world mixed with goodness and beauty and with evil and sort of a sense of also then contingency and frustration and limits, you also have this actor, that's us, who is a choice maker. And that's one of the most important things about, that's one of the signature things about being a human. This is where we're hitting the last part of the course. It's come up most, I think it came out very clearly in our study of Augustine. It came out again when we were working on Genesis. But just to return to Hannah Arendt as a political philosopher, she is the one, remember, who talks about this idea of the banality of evil, of the sort of, we think of evil as being this sort of radical monster thing. But evil is a guy who wakes up in the morning and then runs the trains to concentration camps and says, oh, I was just doing my job. From her analysis, her political analysis, what she says is really important for morality and politics is that humans be able to exercise something she calls judgment. So if I've introduced us as people with real freedom, but freedom within limits or within contexts, that makes us a judge, right? Judging between possibilities, outcomes, characters, fates, but also there's a way in which we become judgeable. Our choices are judgeable. And that implies external judge. An external judge could be something divine. It could be another human, right? But this idea that ethical responsibility has some relationship to judgment. Now, what Arendt thinks is that cultivating judgment in the particular sense she means it, of this independence and reflectiveness of mind that allows you to break away from groupthink, from sort of unquestioning ethical action. She sees that as being the spring for, I guess you'd say, ethical politics and the spring against evil. In other traditions, you might hear about it in terms of conscience. So that's a quick walkthrough of the course, and another walkthrough of the themes, just as a reminder for you as we're heading into Blood Meridian. So what we did was we started out with the book's epigraphs. Let me get that really fast. I actually have the book under here. Ta-da! And I had us work on particularly two of the epigraphs. So if you go to the beginning, you have this one quotation from Paul Valery, or Valerie. Your ideas are terrifying and your hearts are faint. Your acts of pity and cruelty are absurd, committed with no calm, as if they were irresistible. Finally, you fear blood, more and more, blood and time. Okay, the last one is a quotation from the Yuma Daily Sun, June 13th, 1982. Clark, who led last year's expedition to the Afar region of northern Ethiopia, and UC Berkeley colleague Tim D. White, also said that a re-examination of a 300,000-year-old fossil skull found in the same region earlier showed evidence of having been scalped. Okay, so in class, I asked students, what do you notice about these quotations? And what they came up with, which I think is really insightful, is that in one, both quotations seem to talk about violence, human violence, and to think about it, there's this sort of sense of dread, especially in the first one. But in the first one, students noted that there's this idea of the quotation says, you commit these evil acts as if they are irresistible. Well, to say as if they are irresistible is not to say that they are irresistible, right? In fact, it seems to say the opposite. Like, you should be able to resist this, but you're behaving as if it's impossible to resist. There's also in the first epigraph more of a sense of like the development of evil, or evil over time, or evil begetting more evil, right? And so, in that sense, maybe there's a learning of evil or an expansive evil. In the last quote, you have a skull that has evidence of scalping dating back from 300 to 300,000 years from 1982. And what students picked up on there is that this is a lot more focused on sort of the permanence of violence, that this violent taste and scalping is extremely brutal, is something that has always been with us, and maybe it's fundamental to us. Maybe it's timeless. Okay, one thing that whenever you're reading a book, you see epigraphs, you need to pay special attention to them, because that's the author kind of drawing your eye to what they think is important. And we learned from Genesis, especially when we look at the first creation account and the second creation account, that in sophisticated writing, you might have things that appear to be opposites, but it's rather that it's maybe the presentation of tensions. So maybe it's not a contradiction, but maybe the presentation of tensions, or of poles, or sort of saying like, you have a creation account 1, creation account 2, there's important emphases in each that reveal something about the human condition and the world. Okay, that's kind of what you see with McCarthy, not just in this very beginning when we're not even talking about what he's actually written yet, but throughout the book. You're gonna have these moments where he's holding things in tension that maybe superficially might seem to counter each other, but I think, like we see in Genesis, it's an author who's trying to capture what is so dynamic and difficult to give an accurate depiction of, which is the complexity of our world and our life. The next thing we did is, and we still did not launch into the text. And the reason we're not launching in it yet is because I've got to give you some tools. So I just gave you a few tools, right? I gave you tools from the perspective of the course. And then we're starting to narrow in on particular things in the text, how to read it, this theme in the book about violence, questions about, violence and its relationship to the human condition, also the relationship between freedom and violence. But now I've got to give you some philosophical tools before we really open the book. And I started this part by saying to students, hey, when we talk about justice, what do we usually focus on? Like, when you hear that word, what does it mean to you? And students came up with a variety of great answers. They said law, policy, ethics, justice is fairness, justice and distribution, and all of those are correct, right? All of those are kind of the world of justice, the language of justice. But how would I say this? If you reduce those, if you take it a step back, because one of the things about philosophy is you'll start out with a question, you'll answer the question, and then you need to kind of keep asking questions. Have you really ended up at the limit of your answer? So if you say justice and fairness, justice and law, justice and ethics, it's not that that's wrong. It's that, well, what do those things have in common? Or what about those things make them connected to justice? And you would say, well, these are all things that are in a way something that we take to be owed. Justice is about what is owed or what is due. And if you push that back another step to like another like a previous question you could ask would be to say, another way to talk about what is owed maybe is to ask what humans need to have a good life or to thrive or to inhabit a just world. And I'm sort of leading pretty heavy here. Part of it, of course, is that I have to do this on my own and we're not having a back and forth. But the upshot of that entire inquiry is to say that what we're really interested in when we're asking questions about justice is we are asking something about the conditions that are needed to live a good life. Which will make you ask, what's the good life? So this is where I introduce our friend Aristotle. We've spent more time in the semester with Plato, and Aristotle is extremely complex, and so I'm not going to get to do a ton of great work on him for you. I'm just trying to add stuff to your toolbox for when we're reading. And so what Aristotle kind of gives us is this account of the human good life, right? The good life is sort of being the aim of our own actions. I guess you might say it would be the proper aim of our actions. And maybe sometimes it's a misunderstood aim. And of our politics. Or like to be legitimate, a commonwealth would need to aim at this good life for its citizens. And it's the concept is eudaimonia, and I'm saying good life. A lot of people translate that as eudaimonia. But I think that maybe to flesh it out for us, the good life can mean a lot of different things. And you might say, well, the good life involves money, or the good life involves freedom, or the good life involves safety, and all of those answers might be part of what's true. But for Aristotle, eudaimonia is something bigger. Sometimes it's translated as blessedness. I think, you could translate it as happiness. To me, the way of talking about it in English that has always made sense is when we say human flourishing. Eudaimonia is human flourishing. And I gave the example, which I know is ridiculous, but I can't think of a better way of explaining it. You know how, like, if you're passing like a car dealership or a business that's just open, then a lot of times they'll have outside like that wavy kind of man. It's not really a man, it's like a line that has arms, and there's like a fan under it, and it waves around, and then like the wind blows it and waves more. Okay, so if you've ever seen one of those things when the fan under it is not turned on, then you know it's kind of like this, right? And then it might not even, and let's say it's not even really full, like it's just totally collapsed if there's no fan at all. But then like if there's a little bit, or maybe the air force of the air outside is just too heavy, then it's like this, you know, just kind of like that. When the fan is at its fullest and it is its strongest and the conditions are best, then that thing, that wavy line human, well, it's not a human, but whatever it is, thing, is sort of at full capacity. It's totally filled, and it's like that. You know, it's just waving all over the place. And it's kind of like the perfect form of what it's supposed to be. Um, and that's what I think human flourishing is. Like, that's how I always explain it. And I can't think of a better way to explain it. It's like, in that example, you know, you can most see what that, I wish I knew what it's called, thing is, when it's fully sort of expressing itself. But why can it do that? Because it has everything it needs to be able to flourish and to be the best that it can be, right? And I think that is maybe like the human most fully alive, like the most fully alive version of the human. And there's so many components of what it takes for a human not just to survive, but to flourish. So human flourishing, I think, is the best translation there. And one thing that, you know, so there are always obviously like limits with Aristotle, in the sense that when we're talking about him now, he obviously has got some blind spots when it comes to sort of how we might apply him about race, or about ableism, or about sexism. Um, and you can read interpreters of Aristotle who will push back on that in Aristotelian ways. But there's a lot in him. Like, he's foundational. And kind of for our purposes, maybe a more accessible way of talking about him is to talk about something from a neo-Aristotelian, which is kind of this group of people who try to recapture or rework Aristotle for our time. It's a neo-Aristotelian named Martha Nussbaum, and her theory, which is called the capabilities approach. This, I think, is the most accessible way for us to talk about kind of real life, practical, brass tacks, break down what eudaimonia actually means. So, how would I explain this? I mean, I know I explained it in class, but again, it's harder in this context. Nussbaum starts out by saying, what is a full human life? Which, in a way, right, it's another way of asking the question that we're asking, which we actually we got to that question in the first place by asking, when we think about justice, what do we usually think about? And so Nussbaum is saying, what is involved in a full human life? And, you know, students answered, and they'll come to mind for you like health, freedom, shelter, there's lots of different kinds of things you can think of like that. It's hard to be able to develop other human capacities when you're starving, for example. Um, and so what Nussbaum says is, okay, think about those things that are a part of the full human life and call them functions. And now ask the question of whether that function is accessible, or a given person has access to activating the function. So they have the function as a need. They have it as something that would be involved in what it meant for them to have a good life. But do they actually have access to what would even like allow the function to function? And that's called what she means by capabilities. And this is not capabilities like, are you capable of getting yourself a house? It's like capabilities in the sense of like, is it even possible to have access to the conditions of a good life? Another way of kind of coming in for us for philosophical inquiry from the perspective of Blood Meridian is actually to talk about attachment theory. So if you've read the book before we are chatting here, you're probably picking up on that I'm really interested in the kid. This is a hero's journey story of a particular bent. And the the person that goes on that journey is the kid. Um, and a lot of what I think we're looking at when we're reading the book is this question about what is the possibility for a good life or a full human life, or even more than that, what is the possibility of a life that escapes committing violence and evil, for people who don't have access to the things that make a good life. Another way of asking the question, or of thinking about the question, like I said, is think about it in terms of attachment theory. So, attachment theory, I mean, again, I can only oversimplify, but it's this idea that there's this sort of core need to develop healthily, especially psychologically, and to develop a healthy sense of self, and to sort of like have an integrated personality and not like a personality disorder. That something like secure attachment to your primary caregiver in like the very beginning of your life, like even in pre-verbal times, is essential, right? So not that it determines everything, but that there's a lot of evidence that if someone's needs are not securely met by their primary caretaker, that their sort of experience of the world, it can take different forms, but basically they view the world around them as unreliable or hostile. This can create a lot of different problems or anxieties, but if you have your needs sort of fairly regularly met by your primary caregivers, that's called a secure attachment. And there's this video of an experiment where a baby and a mom are playing together, and then they're doing like a hide and seek type peekaboo thing, and then the mom's face goes blank. And so all the baby's bids for attention to the mom. The mom's just like, and the baby keeps trying, like laughing, trying to play, moving its hands, cooing, and then to get distressed, and then to start crying. And all of these are bids for attention, for connection. But the mom is required in the study to be to all of it. And so eventually, after a certain amount of time, she can relent and engage again, and the baby's distress, like they can reattach, and then the baby's distress can ameliorate, but the baby can get pretty upset. And honestly, I hate that experiment. It's really upsetting. But one of the ideas is, right, that if you're able to develop this secure attachment, that you can self-soothe, and you can sort of develop and encounter adversity and develop resilience. So attachment theory and sort of the idea of the primary needs of a very young person, fundamental beginning needs that we all have in human development. If we really want to extend the capabilities approach of Nussbaum, if we really want to do this neo-Aristotelian thing, we need to ask not just about sort of the question from a general perspective of what conditions are necessary or part of human flourishing. We need to think about human development, and sort of like the early stages of our development are sort of foundational. They're essential. So much can go wrong in that. Plato knows about this, right? Because in the Republic, he expels people above a certain age from the city because he's basically like, they cannot relearn certain things. And I mean, I don't think anyone in attachment theory would say anything that dramatic, but my point is that if we're thinking about a full and flourishing human life, we should pay special attention to the condition of a young person or a child or a baby's relationships to their caregivers, or if there's even a caregiver or sort of mentor figure present at all. Okay, so put together all the things I told you now. We've got first this sort of experience of the world where you can have goodness, but you can also have hostility, where there's a lot of things that are outside of our control, and where we are choosers, and in that sense we have to cultivate our judgment. But now add to all of that what we just talked about basically human development, what humans need in terms of what it would take for them to live a good life. Eudaimonia and sort of this concept of human flourishing, it focuses a lot on what it means to be human, like our sort of us at our best, us most fully alive. And what I've introduced to you with Nussbaum and with attachment theory is the possibility that in addition to this world that has goodness in it, but also has evil in it, and has uncertainty and danger and violence, in addition to that, we're also these creatures that are very hardy in a lot of ways, But in other ways, in terms of development, we are very fragile, or we require a lot to thrive. And all of these things together unite them and keep them in mind as we think about the kid, as we think of him as someone on the hero's journey, and we sort of think about politics reading Blood Meridian. So now let's finally turn to the text, and I'm not going to be able to do it justice. I'm not going to be able to simulate either the classroom experience, but I'm hoping that I can communicate enough to you that it gives us a little bit to work with. Like I said, I'm not going to go into as much as I could in other conditions, but hopefully at least a little here. So the very first page, it always blows me away. I don't know if you guys remember Ecce Homo, Behold the Man. That's from the Gospel. It's said about Jesus when he's preparing to die or to be killed. And also it's the name of something written by Nietzsche. Just keep that in mind, because the very first sentence is, that's my dog. That's not the first sentence. The very first sentence is, see the child, right? So, behold the man, see the child. McCarthy is playing with, philosophy here and with theology, just from the intro. See the child. He is pale and thin. He wears a thin and ragged linen shirt. He stokes the scullery fire. Outside lie dark, turned fields with rags of snow, and darker woods beyond that harbor yet a few last wolves. His folk are known for hewers of wood and drawers of water, but in truth, his father has been a schoolmaster. He lies in drink. He quotes from poets whose names are now lost. The boy crouches by the fire and watches him. Night of your birth, 33. The Leonids they were called. God, how the stars did fall. I looked for blackness, holes in the heavens, the dipper stove. The mother dead these 14 years did incubate in her own bosom the creature who would carry her off. The father never speaks her name. The child does not know it. He has a sister in this world that he will not see again. He watches, pale and unwashed. He can neither read nor write, and in him broods already a taste for mindless violence. All history present in that visage. The child, the father of the man. There's a couple of remarks we can make here. We've talked a lot in this class about names and the importance of names. We talked about naming with Cain and Abel, and Eve sort of gives Cain this name where he's like got a meaning attached to his name, and then Abel, we're just told his name. There's no sort of meaning. And then the third son in Genesis is named with another name that has a meaning. We talked about Frederick Douglass describing like his very faint memories of his mother, who would travel all of this way as an enslaved woman just to be able to see him, and he could barely remember her, and she was really risking her life when she did that. But it broke her heart that they were separated, and he can't really remember much of her at all. And he begins his biography, or one of the biographies, talking about this, and mentioning that he didn't know his birthday, right? So this idea of the origin, especially the origin in relationship to the mother, is something that's significant, and we've talked about it in class. It's significant for someone's identity, and their sense of self. And here, the kid, he doesn't have a name. He's just the kid. And you should be wondering, as we're going, what does that represent? What could it mean? How could you interpret that? How could you understand that in the context of political philosophy? To go through it just in order really fast, you've got the child. He's pale and thin. He wears a thin and ragged linen shirt. So he himself is not healthy, right? He's pale and thin. So he doesn't have enough food. He doesn't have enough of the things you need to have physical flourishing. He wears a thin and ragged linen shirt. And then his clothes aren't any better, right? So his body is not cared for, and his clothes don't offer him any protection. And he's sitting there and he's stoking the fire, meaning he's trying to get warmth out of it. Then you find out there are wolves outside the door. Here's this pitiful kid, this cold kid, and you find out that he's sitting in front of his dad. And like, as you keep going, you see that here's this kid, super cold, clearly malnourished. I mean, that's the implication. His clothing's not warm enough, and they're inside this cold house, but at least it offers protection from wolves. But that kind of tells you about what the world is like outside, how hostile it is, how dangerous. And then, his folk are known for hewers of wood and drawers of water. But the kid's father, it turns out, is a schoolmaster. And, this is at a time in history where a lot of people would not have been literate. He's extremely educated to the point that he's able to talk about these poets whose names are now lost. And I always took this to mean that he's reciting poetry that's ancient. Or maybe these sort of classical poems, right? And to do that, this is just me interpreting here. I could be totally wrong. But to do that, he would have had to have known Greek and Latin, or Greek or Latin. And so, he's educated, he's literate. It's possible that he speaks other languages. He's refined enough to know poetry. He's out here in a subsistence situation, and poetry is associated with leisure. Learning is associated with leisure because you need free time to do that kind of thing. Here he is, though, with this starving child, and he lies in drink. He quotes from poets whose names are now lost. So he's a drunkard. The kid is neglected. His father is impotent. His father's not taking care of him. In fact, his father's just watching him, the kid, as he tries to make himself warm, because the kid cannot rely on his father to even give him warmth. Why? Well, for one, it seems the father is a drunk. And then, to think about, father has this great gift of literacy and education. We find out that his own child can't even read. That's insane. Like, as a parent, if you think about this just from the perspective of development, when you've got something that's extremely worthwhile, it's like an inheritance to your kid. Like, you could think, well, if you had all this money, you'd want to make sure your kid would have access to it someday, and that while you were caring for the kid, that you were able to use the money to care for their needs and give them opportunities. Okay, that's how parents are with money and children. So think about these goods that are more abstract, like education. That's a door that you can open for your child. You would think that's an inheritance you can give them. It's a key to unlock the world. You would want so much to pass that along. But this father has not taught him to read. And he's 14 years old. That is extremely sad. This is a total failure of a father. Total failure. The mother dead these 14 years did incubate in her own bosom the creature who would carry her off. So there's a possibility, right, that the father resents his son because the mother died giving birth to him. And when he was born, you have this meteor shower. It's strange that the father looks for blackness in that. You might say, why wouldn't you look at the light? But if his wife is dying, anyways, that's just speculation. The father never speaks her name, and the child does not know it. Here, there you go, the name thing again, and the origins and the connection to the mother. So he didn't get to know his mother, but he doesn't even know her name. That is how withdrawn the father is. And the sister's gone. You can imagine if this is what home's like. She'd get out of there as fast as she can, just like the kid's going to get out of there as fast as he can. So this idea of sort of like the maternal influence, and I think, the paternal and the maternal impulses can offer different things in terms of child rearing. The father's impotent, the mother is dead, the sister who might play a maternal role is gone. So he's got neither mother nor father, and whatever those things can provide. So the father never speaks her name. The child does not know it. Remember the Douglas thing there, Frederick Douglass. He has a sister in this world he will not see again. He watches, pale and unwashed. Okay, and it seems that he's sitting there. The boy crouches by the fire and watches him. He's there trying to make himself warm, and he's like looking at his dad. And this is something like with kids, no matter how horrible their parent is, no matter how terrible their parent is, there's this way that they look at them, like with longing or with dependence, or like with maybe this time it'll be different. He watches pale and unwashed. That's my dog again. He can neither read nor write. And in him broods already a taste for mindless violence. There you go. So we have condensed into this little framework a very sad story. A human soul that has been deprived of some of the most important things for meaning and health and safety in life. And all that comes across to us in such a small space of time. And then we're told in his self, there's already this taste for mindless violence. Okay, well, what's the idea? If we're thinking about this from the perspective of political philosophy, we're thinking about the idea that deprivation or lack has a connection, there's a causal relationship between deprivation and lack and violence. There's something about the kid's life that has put him in a place where mindless violence lurks inside him. Think of what I just said, right? Deprivation and lack cultivate violence. The very next line is, all history present in that visage, the child, the father of the man. All history present in that visage, the child, the father of the man. And so you can think of that in terms of the particular of the kid. You know, he's clearly getting ready to set out on his hero journey because he's about to run away from this terrible situation that needs to change. But you can also think of it as a more universal thing. All history present in that visage, the history of the human condition, the history of the human world. Lack and deprivation cultivating, setting up the potential for the appeal of violence. And the early experiences of an individual and perhaps of the world in terms of history shape the development of the later years. You could think of it in the particular for an individual, for the kid. You can think about it in terms of the world. This idea that there's path dependency, and that moment, that childhood, is very key for how things are set up. We talked about his sort of journey. He obviously runs away. 14, he runs away. He will not see again the freezing kitchen house in the pre-dawn dark. Okay, and then you sort of see through his eyes what the world is like. Well, home is worse than what's out there, but what's out there sounds really rough, and you already see kind of the book very early introduces you to some of the brutality and cruelty that the world has. You know, okay, starting out with child abuse and neglect, and then you've got introduced pretty early on, you've got racism, you've got a hanging and violence, you've got this international port where even though you have people from all parts of the world, so there's a vast diversity of cultures, everyone is violent when he's in this part of his journey. And again, there's this through line. Even these people with these very different, upbringings, very different cultures, what is uniting them? Well, the propensity for violence. And the kid is injured and he's taken care of by a woman. And you're going to see that a lot of the moments when the kid finds some sort of gentleness toward him in the beginning comes from a woman or maybe a person of color. That's something that kind of recurs throughout the book early on a few times. And after he's sort of gratuitously, cared for by this woman, he leaves. He's not able to pay her, so he leaves without saying anything to her. You kind of wonder, maybe he didn't know what to do with a woman that was caring for him. He didn't have a mom. She brings his meals. She carries out his slops. A hard-looking woman with a wiry body like a man's. By the time he's mended, he has no money to pay her, and he leaves in the night and sleeps on the riverbank until he can find a boat that will take him on. The boat is going to Texas. It says at this point, only now is the child finally divested of all that he has been. Okay. And the next paragraph, I think, is really important. I think this is basically question of the whole novel. And remember, we started out, we're talking about how in Genesis you have these two creation stories and they're meant, to hold tensions together, right? That's something fiction can do. And we looked at the epigraphs at the beginning and we contrasted them, and sort of you have this more developmental idea of violence, and then you have this more sort of permanent, it's in our DNA, it's ancient idea of violence. And so you have these things you're holding in tension together. This is another moment where something is described or revealed that is a tension that's being held together, that's inviting you in. If we're thinking about this as philosophers, like to consider, to reflect more. This is also another part you can interpret from the perspective, again, of in the individual, and in the particular case of the individual known as the kid, but you can also kind of think of it on a more universal level, on something about what it can tell us about the human condition or about human civilization. So the kid is finally divested of all that he's been. His origins are become remote, as is his destiny. And not again, in all the world's turning, will there be terrain so wild and barbarous to try whether the stuff of creation may be shaped to man's will, or whether his own heart is not another kind of clay. And here, the West, of course, this is the terrain. It's representative of alienation, of danger, of sort of nature that is hostile, that it's not even clear that we can master. But there's also this idea of, maybe the world is just generally like that. I think at a different point he uses the word of like this Gnostic planet, this name of this Gnostic planet, sort of forlorn place, I think, if I'm remembering correctly. When we're at that part of the book, I will remember better. But there's sort of this sense that there's this world. It's not just alien to us. It's also filled with violence and barbarism and potential threat, hostility. The question is, not again in all the world's turning will there be terrain so wild and barbarous to try whether the stuff of creation may be shaped to man's will. So is this, you could say literally the West, the terrain, but then you could also say everything that it represents that we just discussed. Is that something that we will be able to impose order on, that man can impose order on? And even you take it further and you say that lurking violence inside the human, right, inside the human soul, that capacity for that, is this something we can impose order on? Whether the stuff of creation may be shaped to man's will. Okay, or is this creation, either literally the West or these representative things that we're talking about, this philosophical representations, what that means, what if those things are shaping us, right? Is our heart not another kind of clay?